Thank you all for coming out today on this beautiful summer day in Minnesota. It's good of you to come. I know there were other things you could have done, but we're out here in support of the Children's Defense Fund, this wonderful organization. An advocacy organization, a lobbyist in behalf of the least powerful, the most vulnerable in our midst. I came to the state capitol for the first time when I was 10 years old. We parked in a school bus over here, and our teacher gave us a lecture about being on our best behavior. We went in those doors and up to the second floor and up to the governor's reception room, where the carpet is so deep that children sink in up to their ankles. All this beautiful gold filigree and plaster work. It was like something out of Europe. It was like a picture from a castle. And the governor came out, a kind of a slight man, Republican from Brainerd, and with sort of half-rim glasses, and he stood out there in the middle of the room, and next to him was one of his aides, and then next to him was our teacher, Mrs. Shaver. And she whispered to the aide the name of each child as we came through to shake the great man's hand. And the aide whispered it to the governor, and somehow in the process, he got mixed up. And so he shook my classmate, Billy Pedersen's hand, and said, "Good to meet you, Shirley." And he shook Bob Nordberg's hand, and he said, "Good to meet you, Elaine." And he shook Elaine's hand and said, "Good to meet you, Charlie." And it was my first idea that adults could be way off the mark, and needed a lot of help. And that's what we're here for. When I was a kid, I used to look up at the tower of the First National Bank building, 31 stories high in St. Paul, and I saw that first up there, the numeral 1 and the ST. And I used to imagine when I was a little kid that meant that Minnesota was number 1 in the country. It's good to believe that, even if it's not true. Which it's not true, but anyway. I always imagined that growing up, and imagined that this was a special place. We used to be, but the Minnesota that you and I believe in hardly exists anymore. It's under attack. The Minnesota that believes in the common good, the most basic part of a democracy. There's a large vocal minority in our midst who do not believe in this, who do not believe in taxation, who believe in reducing government to a small rump that's powerless to do what needs to be done for the common good. And we have to fight for this basic idea that we grew up thinking was permanent and guaranteed. It's not. Our friends in New York and California imagine Minnesota as a very different state from what we actually have here. They think of us as some sort of enlightened democracy in the Midwest. They're thinking about Hubert Humphrey or something else. But it doesn't exist anymore. We used to be ranked, in public education, we used to be ranked up towards the top with Vermont and Maine and those New England states. And we're going down, 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 down. We're going down towards Oklahoma, and we're going to wind up next to Mississippi. That's where we're going in this state. It has to be defended. And that's what the Children's Defense Fund does. It's an advocacy group that studies the effect of public policy on the lives of children and lets bureaucrats and politicians know what that effect is. Very simple. Very simple. We all have a place in our hearts for children. Everybody does. If we see a child being abused in public, even the shyest Minnesotan would stop and say something. Our hearts might be pounding, we might be terrified, but we'd walk up and we'd say, stop. Every one of us would. When we read memoirs of people who've been abused as children, it pulls at our hearts. If we see pictures in the paper of malnutrition, and we see children who are skin and bones in this country or others, that image remains with us for the rest of the day. If we go to visit somebody in the hospital and we take a wrong turn and we go down a hallway and we go into pediatric cardiology or we go into pediatric oncology and we see the patients in their robes and nightgowns and their parents, it rips your heart. It just tears at you, the suffering of children. When we yell at our own children, we feel guilty about it for hours afterward. This was not always the case. 100 and some years ago, there were no child labor laws. Children were put to work in factories at the age of 10 and 12 as soon as they had any sort of motor skills at all. They were sent down into the mines. They did all sorts of dangerous work. The orphan trains came through Minnesota out towards the Dakotas and Montana. Trains filled with children that were collected in the big cities of the East, in New York and Philadelphia and Boston. Children whose parents had died or were no longer able to care for them. And they stopped in the little towns in Minnesota and out on the prairie in North Dakota. They'd stop in Wilmer and they'd stop in Fargo. They'd go on out to Valley City. They'd go on out to Billings. And in each of these cities, the orphans would get off the train and they'd stand on the platform. In little groups of 2 and 3, sisters and brothers clutching to each other, hoping to be taken as a family group. And if you needed to buy a child, you went down to the train station and you got some. And not too many questions were asked about that. You took them home and you put them to work on your farm. And how you treated those children was your business. And if you were alcoholic and you beat them in your alcoholic stupor, they had to deal with this themselves. That was this country not so long ago, in our grandparents' time. This changed. It changed for many reasons. It changed for one thing because of a writer, a novelist, Charles Dickens, who had suffered terribly as a child and whose father was put into debtor's prison in England before our Civil War, and so grew up to write novels about the sufferings of children in David Copperfield and Oliver Twist and Great Expectations and A Christmas Carol. God bless us everyone, said little tiny Tim. And this developed popular sympathy for children, novels, fiction. But there are all kinds of child abuse, and some of it is perpetrated by bureaucrats and politicians who, in order to create a better business climate in Minnesota, by creating a tax structure that allows the wealthy and the powerful to have their home and their summer home and their winter home and run their boat and go to Italy in the spring and be able to send their children to schools for the academically challenged and financially gifted. In order to create this business climate, we cut public education. This state now ranks 36th in class size. 36th in our country. It ranks 49th in the ratio of guidance counselors to students in public schools. If you come from a low-income family, Your parents work 2 jobs. You might appreciate having a guidance counselor in school who has some time to spend with you. But it's not going to happen in Minnesota. Our state has changed. Our state has changed, and don't imagine that it has not. Childhood is scary. It's always going to be scary. There are things we can't change. To be small, to be powerless, is always going to be frightening. And there will always be trouble, especially in Minnesota, where winter comes sweeping down here in another few months. Winter comes sweeping down from Saskatchewan, and you, a child, are sent off to school because schools never closed down. At least they didn't back in my day. They never closed the schools. We listened for school closings, and they never said Anoka. Once you start closing schools in Minnesota, where would you stop? So we were sent off walking down a gravel road in a whiteout blizzard, unable to see your hand in front of your face, growing up in weather that told you only too clearly that nature was trying to wipe you out. I grew up in a low thermostat house. My father believed that if you could not see your breath when you talked, then you were wasting fuel. Not that we talked, we did not. We knew each other well enough. We sat at the table in the evening and we ate our gruel and we went upstairs to bed, up in the attic. Heat is supposed to rise, but it did not rise in our house. It was cold up there, it was freezing cold. And you crawled into your little bed, into your little cotton envelope, and you went in with your clothes. You didn't take your clothes up. No bathing before you went to bed. It would have killed you. There was no thought of bedwetting, absolutely none. You slept there, shivering, and you got up in the morning and you had your hot shredded Ralston for breakfast, and then you were sent out before lightweight thermal wear. You kept warm back in the day by wearing layers and layers of woolens and corduroy and sweaters and sweatshirts and a big parka. You kept warm by the exertion of carrying heavy clothing. Little 87-pound Sherpa going out across the wind-crusted snow, carrying 42 pounds of clothing on your back. There's no lightweight thermal wear back then. You went through a whiteout blizzard. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and my arms were shorter back then, so it was really heavy snow, blizzard. You walked out to the end of the road, and you waited out there for the bus to come, or if not the bus, then a sleigh would come, drawn by a couple of horses and driven by a man you'd never seen before. But we trusted the schools back then, and he had reins wound up around his forearms. He had a big handlebar mustache, and he was wearing a bearskin coat. We dove in under the buffalo robes into the back of the sleigh, and out across the crusted snow we went. And when the runners broke through the snow, then we went down a rocky slope onto the Mississippi River, onto the ice, and on upstream we went, swerving from side to side sometimes to avoid these tattered men in gray who dashed out from behind rocks and trees, the last remnants of the Army of Northern Virginia who were trying to snatch little Yankee children to hold us for ransoms to raise money to buy gunpowder from the British so that the Confederacy would rise again, which it did not until the Republican Party brought it back. That was my childhood. We can't alleviate all of the aches and pains of childhood. But we're here today to argue for the basic idea of the common good. We won't last forever, you and I. We will pass from the scene, and we will not be missed as much as we might imagine. Other people will take our place here in this city and in this state. and I wish them well. I hope that these children grow up to have beautiful lives in the city of St. Paul, and that they dance and they make art and they enjoy theater and movies and they fall in love and they have their own families and they take over our houses and our city. I wish them all well. I wish the future well. But we have to hold on to this idea of the common good. I pay into the public treasury according to my means. And I pay into the schools and into public welfare and into enrichment programs for children. All these programs that I will never see, I pay for them because we all live in this place together. And we're all here together. The alternative is to divide up into armed enclaves and live in suspicion and fear of each other. We can't do it. We have to defend our state of Minnesota. And God bless you all for coming, and God bless the Children's Defense Fund for their good work. Thank you.